Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2020 SFSU's Constitution and Citizenship Day Conference. I want to thank our two speakers who have agreed to join us in a virtual conversation this year, and I'll introduce both of them at the outset in alphabetical order. So Kacey Calahane is an associate faculty member at Saddleback College and a doctoral candidate in history at the University of California, Irvine. Her dissertation, which I love this title, "The General and Her Soldiers, How Phyllis Schlafly and Eagle Forum Mobilized the Conservative Movement," examines the institutions conservative anti-feminists erected to network grassroots activists to business leaders and politicians in order to guide the direction of right-wing policymaking in the United States since the 1970s. Kacey is an editorial assistant for the journal Women and Social Movements in the United States, 1600 to 2000, published by Alexandria Street Press. And she is also a co-host of the wonderful podcast, Historians on Housewives, and a co-editor of the forthcoming Historians on Housewives anthology. So thank you, Kacey, for joining us. And also a shout out, she is a former SFSU grad. So to our SFSU students who are watching us today, oh, the places you will go. So our second panelist, Gillian Frank, received his PhD in American Studies from Brown University. He has published broadly on issues related to sexuality and gender in the United States, with work appearing in venues such as Gender and History, the Journal of the History of Sexuality, and the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture. He co-edited an anthology with UNC Press in 2018 entitled Devotions and Desires, Histories of Sexuality and Religion in the 20th Century. He has been the recipient of numerous fellowships, including the American Council of Learned Societies and the Louisville Institute. And he is now working on a book project entitled Making Choice Sacred, Liberal Religion and Reproductive Rights Before Roe v. Wade. You can also find Gill on his podcast, Sexing History. So clearly I need to get a podcast. But thank you and welcome to you both. The theme of this year's conference, we're marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Yesterday we recorded a keynote lecture and roundtable with Ellen Du Bois about the campaign for women's suffrage, often referred to as the first wave of women's rights movements. And the theme of this year's conference, in addition to marking the passage of the 19th Amendment, is also the unfinished work of suffrage. And so today we're talking about what historians sometimes refer to as the so-called second wave of feminism. So Kacey, let me start with you. Can you set the stage a little bit here? I want to first acknowledge that a lot of historians have really pushed back against this narrative of first wave and second wave because it erases sort of the continuity between the two and all of the work that goes on in between. But today we are going to be talking about the 1960s and 1970s. And so what issues are on the table for feminists and the conservative anti-feminists who oppose them that your dissertation really importantly highlights?
When I think of the 1960s and 1970s, it is such an explosion of activism. So in the 60s, we have the creation of the President's Committee on the Status of Women, investigating these issues of gender inequality. You have women like Patsy Takamado Mink in Congress working toward legislation like Title IX. There's all sorts of movements around women's bodies and women's health, right, that we see with the Boston Women's Health Collective coming out with Our Bodies, Ourselves, which is still getting reprinted in hundreds of languages today. By the 60s, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Pauli Murray are already working through legal channels on what sometimes is referred to as the New Departure, which was a method of applying the 14th Amendment to existing laws to just instantly strike down what could be considered unconstitutional based on that 14th Amendment precedent. And the President's Commission on the Status of Women was quite popular. And so that was even happening at state level commissions, right? So states were already doing a lot of this work to kind of revamp legal codes. And so by the time the ERA is really in the zeitgeist, by the early 70s, things were already in the process of transforming in locales across the nation. In terms of conservative women's politics, the 1964 election with Barry Goldwater was incredibly contentious. And what happened was it was really splitting conservative women's auxiliaries for the Republican Party, right? With women who thought that Barry Goldwater was a crazy extremist, right? Who was completely terrible for the party, and women who believed, right, that this ultra-conservative politics was the way of the future and really should be what informed their party politics. Not too unlike what we saw in 2016 with kind of this never Trump versus pro-Trump sort of splits. And so this was completely remaking conservative women's groups. They were really focused in general on the Cold War, anti-communism, foreign policy. And they really weren't at the time that focused yet on what we would consider the feminist movement, right? They were really thinking about this issue of communist infiltration. And it really took the ERA debates in a lot of ways in the 70s to kind of start connecting a lot of these issues between what we see as a pro-life movement and a Christian conservatism, right? These all kind of start to meld together later into the 70s, but it's a kind of a slow transformation.
Interesting. And Gill, this really speaks to your work, right? I mean, you sort of talk about how these issues kind of meld or crystallize together and form a kind of conservative coalition that makes a more cohesive backlash against a varieties of these liberation movements of the 60s and 70s.
Sure, and that was great, Kacey. I would add a few things that are happening on the ground from the early 60s and suggest that there's a much longer conservative cultural politics that's really emerging around World War II and moving forward. Anti-communism is certainly at the heart of it, but anti-communism becomes sort of a meta-language to talk about a lot of other things, from racial integration, which is picking up steam, certainly around World War II, but by the 50s, conservative anti-integration movements, particularly when it comes to schooling. Later on, it moves into the area of busing, are amplifying rapidly. Abortion, which is on the Catholic radar really from the early 60s, as a number of legislators and various organizations, professional organizations, are begun flouting or at least advancing legal reforms. And so the Catholic Church is rapidly mobilizing, but as is the Mormon Church. Pornography, which is a significant issue in the early 50s and continues to grow. All of these are seeing women's movements, whether they're organized through churches or women's auxiliaries, beginning to pick up steam. And so, as Kacey said a moment ago, the Equal Rights Amendment and the anti-ERA movement sees this as a clustering. They see it as a not only this, but that. And anti-communism sets up a grassroots network that begins to expand and grow, not just from anti-Catholic communists Catholic anti-communists and various Protestant groups, but to seeking out new alliances, Mormons, Orthodox Jews, and so forth, and they begin to see these as interconnected. But when we look at how, at least in the early 60s, and certainly by the 70s, when an explicit anti-communist language falls away, early on in the 60s through the late 60s, it's always pornography and communism, abortion and communism, integration and communism. So if we want to mark a transition to the pushback against an expansion of who is included in full citizenship, anti-communism really offers a groundwork for a lot of this.
Well, and I just wanted to add to Gill's point that part of this other phenomenon is that because there's so many kind of coffee klatch meetings, it's really not uncommon in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, for women's groups to already be issuing their own newsletters, especially in terms of conservative politics, right? So there's already quite an apparatus for making contacts, sharing information, really having a more uniform kind of messaging, right? It's very common practice for women to kind of just copy an entire letter from another organization and put it out on their own letterhead, right? And so this is already how these organizations, by and large, are operating before the Equal Rights Amendment comes to the table to offer them this entirely new vehicle to kind of have this large pot mix and stir sort of approach.
Yeah, and I think that I'll just speak about when I teach this to my students in my classes. I think they're often surprised that the conservative movement has such a long history around. I mean, I think the way we sometimes talk about it or think about it is that Roe v. Wade happened in 1973, and this spontaneous movement just sort of emerged, out of the kind of outrage, and that people had kind of held these anti-choice, anti-abortion feelings for a long time, or that, when we think about Anita Bryant and, her sort of campaign against the legislation here in San Francisco, that, this was just kind of a movement, against queer liberation, that sort of the silent majority spoke. And I think people fail to recognize that, we haven't done a good enough job of telling people that people have been thinking about these issues for a long time. They had been writing about these issues, organizing around these issues. And as both of you point out, they had sort of found ways to blend these issues into frameworks that people were already thinking about. And so, the movement that becomes very public in the 70s has this sort of edifice, this foundation underneath it. And we're seeing maybe sort of figureheads pop up. But it's not like Athena from Zeus's head. Like, they didn't just emerge fully formed, right? They had this longer history, and they were building on the work of other people.
Absolutely, and Bryant is a perfect example of that. I mean, she's drawing from deep wells of anti-gay sentiment that were dating back to the Florida Johns Commission, which was an anti-communist purge that focused on school teachers after basically what happened was the NAACP got an injunction against them, so they couldn't go after African-American organizations. So they switched to an anti-gay purge. And the same language that you would see in their notorious Purple pamphlet gets directly cribbed in Bryant's movement, right? But what she also does is she draws from the anti-busing crowd and the anti-abortion crowd. And their big coalescing idea is, liberalism and gay liberation are going to endanger our children. And so when she's talking about the sort of homosexual menace and the threats of corruption and seduction, I mean, this is long-standing, decades-old language, but she's really drawing in, and when I say she, I'm talking about her organization. I see her as much more of a figurehead than as someone who is organizing and mobilizing. The folks who are on her board are long-standing conservatives, folks who are seeing these, what they call cultural and polarizing issues, as a way to advance their own economic agendas, but they're also long-standing anti-integrationists there. So Bryant is a perfect example of how anti-gay activism is both deep-rooted, but also is being used to sort of as a lightning rod to draw people into a very much swelling conservative movement, both in Florida, but also nationally.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, I mean, in some ways this question is unanswerable, but I wonder if we could just think aloud together. When we see these people like Anita Bryant, when we see the Phyllis Schlaflys, when we even think about sort of the Jerry Falwells, and they become very visible, powerful leaders of this new conservative movement that frames itself as pro-life, pro-family, pro-woman, pro-child, to what extent, I'm trying to frame this very carefully here. To what extent are these new issues for them that allow them to move forward an agenda that they've cared about for a long time? I'm trying not to use the word opportunistic here. In what ways can we see them as being authentically engaged in a lifelong project? Or can we see them being caring for a long time in their personal lives and their political activism about abortion, about gay issues? Or is this, they get their start as anti-communism, maybe that's not gaining the traction that they want it to, and so then, or they get their start in the segregationist movement, you know, the defending segregation, as some people have suggested for Falwell, and you know, and they see that as a losing issue, and so here is something that they sort of, you know, move the train towards a new station.
What I see, at least when I look at Phyllis Schlafly's organization and the history of where Schlafly is coming in and out of this movement, is a lot of grassroots conservative women already had their hand in these various aspects of the movement, right, for a long time, right? So by the time that they're mobilizing around the ERA and really connecting this to anti-gay politics, anti-abortion politics, a lot of these people had already worked together for years, right, on a lot of different projects. The other way I like to think about it is how are these families connected, right, both socially and professionally? Where is money moving? How is it being exchanged from maybe one part of the movement to another part of the movement? Right, so one of the things I look at is how are they actually creating and using super PAC monies? Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, yes, it can seem very opportunistic. I think in other ways, it is more of a culmination of many, many years of very meticulous work.
I would say a couple of things. And it's a hard question I've bumped up against time and again. Are they cynical or are they true believers? And sometimes the answer is very clear, and sometimes it depends on the issue. What I would start with this. I think a good framework for understanding the backlash against the various civil rights movements are, just like various civil rights movements, they're also intersectional. They have a host of issues that they're concerned about. It's not intersectional in the terms that we would think about it, in that they'll see race and class and gender in a progressive sense, but they'll see it in a reactionary sense. And so for someone like Schlafly, who would have been hearing anti-abortion messages for a long time before Roe v. Wade happens, and she would have been hearing, at least in conservative Catholic circles, anti-busing and anti-integration messages, because there was a strong white supremacist through line in a lot of conservative Catholicism. But a lot of what's happening with these movements is that progressivism is changing the name of the game. And so when you see municipalities passing gay rights ordinances and states passing them, or when you see the ERA being passed on the state level, or when you see various states liberalizing abortion, or when you see various lawsuits basically transforming the dynamics of wages, of the meaning and practice of equality, a lot of movements are going to be responding, both sort of nationally, but also on a state-by-state, municipality-by-municipality thing, and they're connecting the dots. And so they'll have a language to describe it. They'll call it sort of a secular humanism, or they'll see it as a communist menace, or all of these things. And so for some, they'll say, oh, this issue has a lot of traction, and in our mailer, it got this many responses and this many donations. Let's run with that for a while. But for some of them, they are genuinely concerned. So the meaning of abortion is going to change after Roe, but it's already changing after New York legalizes in 1970. And so once abortion is, as they called it at the time, on demand, it was no longer this sort of issue where women's lives were endangered by criminalizing abortion. This was now an abuse of life. And so this changes rapidly for evangelicals. It changes for a lot of Catholics too, who are on the fence. It certainly changes for a number of people. And so I think that we need to see it as not just a long-term enactment of a conservative agenda, but a dynamic, growing political movement that is in response to a series of shifting political battles.
One of the really interesting things that Schlafly does in terms of a national organization with lots of local state chapters, is she creates an education program that begins almost immediately when she founds her organization in the late 60s, when she splits from the National Federation of Republican Women and takes her faction with her, essentially. But that education platform has continued down to today, right, where they have conference after conference with breakout rooms for various, conservative issues. And it really becomes like this think space for how they're going to mobilize, what the best practices in mobilizing for a particular issue are, right? And this is a way that they essentially perfect their own communication and engage in outreach with other conservative organizations, right, to continue coalition building. And so for me, that kind of relationship speaks to this way that Gill talks about of seeing this as a very dynamic movement that is constantly kind of transforming.
Yeah, I wonder if we could talk and think a little bit more about Phyllis Schlafly, who we'll get to Mrs. America in a few minutes, but Phyllis Schlafly seems to be having her moment right now. And to think about, well, two things really. One, to think about the rhetoric around the ERA and how Schlafly seizes on a sort of pro-woman, right? That she, the ERA is sort of, Alice Paul, of course, introduces it right after the suffrage amendment. The ERA is quite literally for Alice Paul, the unfinished work of suffrage, and just a very simple, short amendment to the Constitution, recognizing the equality based on sex. But Phyllis Schlafly sort of frames that as it is an anti-woman thing, right? It is a danger to women. And she and conservative women are defending womanhood. And so, I mean, I think implicitly here, one of the things is it's defending white womanhood. And maybe we can talk and think about that. But how does she, as a leader, sort of, why does she choose this frame? How does she choose this frame? And then, of course, one of the debates that goes on about Mrs. America is this, is it a feminist act for her to accrue and wield this power and to speak using this rhetoric? And how do we understand Schlafly's enormous power that she accrues, enormous political capital in the 1970s and beyond? I mean, I think we think that Phyllis Schlafly goes away, but of course, what Kacey's dissertation shows is she remains enormously powerful and influential in conservative circles.
Which question would you like us to start with?
Yeah, any and all. Yeah.
All right, could you just, because there's a lot there, could you just restate really quickly?
Well, maybe we could just start with the ERA and how she uses, what you think about her use of the pro-woman framing to say that it is the ERA that is anti-woman. And it's her sort of movement to quash the ERA that is sort of really what is protecting women.
Right. I mean, so what Schlafly is very good at throughout the movement is packaging the dangers of the ERA in various ways. So in her newsletter, she'll have these long lists of all the mischiefs, as she calls it, that the ERA will enact. But she's also very good at sound bites. The ERA will cause women to lose custody. The ERA will cause women not to get alimony from a divorce revolution. The ERA will force women, I mean, she uses the word force a lot, force women to change in the same room as men, use the same bathrooms as them, be in the same spaces as black men. She uses all of these things. So when she imagines women here, she represents them as both sort of in a particular relationship to men, both in need of protection, particularly through the family. And so she's using and drawing on particularly evangelical languages about headship and submissiveness, which she then articulates in books like The Power of the Positive Women. But women is always already endangered by men. And so it's a sort of, she doesn't think very much of men throughout, but at the same time wants to hold on to this particular patriarchal breadwinner masculinity that women, if they lose, will be cast into the dangers of a sort of savage male world of capitalism that will degrade them. At the same time, women are always threatened by the man's world, the draft, a pernicious, sexually violent masculinity, and so forth. And so for her, womanhood is something that is both sacred and in need of protection. And the beast is the one that they have to marry, but also need to be protected from. And so this is her particular mode of categorizing the ERA as anti-woman, because it's an anti-particular gender arrangement, is how I would describe it.
Mm-hmm.
When I look at Schlafly and her stance on the ERA and her articulation of what a pro-womanhood is, right, is she is essentially repackaging 19th century ideologies about white womanhood, right? This is coverture, this is Republican womanhood, this is the cult of domesticity in separate spheres, right? And so this is also about the privilege of white womanhood, right? Like being on that pedestal and the danger that ERA poses for taking a sort of special status away from white women in particular. The other aspect that I always find really interesting about some of Schlafly's articulations about what can happen because of the ERA is not actually really unlike anything that ERA detractors had been raising since it was first introduced in 1923, right? And then in that response, she frequently, again and again and again, reminds people, she goes, well, we don't know what's going to happen to protective labor legislation, right? So it's kind of like the bone that she throws to working class women, right? And of course, supporters of the ERA always said, well, ERA is going to allow labor legislation for men to meet that of women, right? But people that were worried about that thought, oh, well, what if it goes the opposite way and women lose their protective labor legislations because, right, they want to make women like men rather than protect men like women. And so actually, Frances Perkins, when she's Secretary of Labor, writes in to Congress, because she can't be at the testimony in person, about all the reasons why she will not support the Equal Rights Amendment passage in the 40s. And of course, it's all about this issue of protective labor for women. And so at least in that aspect, Schlafly is, again, kind of playing off the fear of, you know, poor working class white women that don't really get this whole benefit of this wealthier white womanhood, if that makes sense.
And if I could add on, I mean, one of the things that Schlafly does so well in a lot of this rhetoric about protecting womanhood is protecting a particular vision of sort of the breadwinner and the housewife, one that has been so powerfully packaged after World War II and was very quickly challenged by people like Friedan and others because it made so many people miserable, but it was also financially unsustainable and made so many demands upon the family that it, you know, women of course were already going back to the workplace to keep up with a consumer culture that invited them to purchase things they couldn't afford. And so Schlafly was offering this dream that was already elusive, a dream at a moment of rising divorce rates, of all sorts of economic dislocations. And so for Schlafly, the danger to womanhood was already speaking to a broader economic, I guess, as I said, dislocation and real tangential, substantial challenges to an ideology that privileged white womanhood as a protected sort of sphere. So I'm just echoing in many ways what Kacey is saying. But I think one of the things to recognize that I want to underline about the power of Schlafly's language is, and this is the power of conservatism at that time, where liberals are speaking the language of choice and opportunity and expanding the playing field and possibility. So that, sure, you can be a housewife, sure, you can do all of these things, but you can also do these things too. They're saying they are forcing these options on us, right? So choice becomes force for them. They're going to force themselves on us. And I think that this is the language of protection that becomes so powerful for Schlafly. Those liberals are going to force their way of life on us, which wasn't the agenda, of course, but packaging it that way makes it seem like an act of sexual violence, which is how she presented it time and time again.
Yeah, even in terms of that issue of consumerism and the fact that it was a very elusive kind of American dream to have a solo breadwinner, male breadwinner by this time. I think in a lot of ways, her arguments about the ERA became a scapegoat, right, for changing economy and crisis, right, for new neoliberal policies that were making it that much harder for a single male breadwinner to support their family without additional labor from their wives. And, you know, in that way, this kind of pro-woman celebration of the white American housewife kind of tapped into those economic anxieties a lot of families felt with austerity measures being introduced throughout the 70s as well.
Mm-hmm. So the second part of my cluster of questions was really, you know, and maybe now could be the moment to begin to drift into Mrs. America, because there's been a debate, and I know that Gill has written a little bit about this, but there's been a debate about the extent to which Cate Blanchett portrays Phyllis Schlafly as a little too sympathetic, and whether or not we can see Phyllis Schlafly and other conservative women as feminists, right? As, you know, is simply to wield power a feminist act or project? Or does it have to be in the service of a larger liberatory framework or a larger collective? And so, you know, at the risk of asking too many questions, what did you think about Cate Blanchett's portrayal of Phyllis Schlafly in Mrs. America? And do you think that it was perhaps too sympathetic, or she is being understood as some kind of a feminist figurehead in light of the Hulu miniseries?
Cate Blanchett is a brilliant actress. Did the script portray Schlafly sympathetically? Yes and no at moments. Where I sort of got stuck and irritated was where they made it sound as if somehow the racism that was baked into the anti-ERA movement was not somehow part of Schlafly's agenda, that she just sort of discovered it elsewhere. And I was like, no, those were her very deliberate choices that she made, and this was part of her long-standing conservatism. And so I thought, I wished that they had portrayed her with this sort of vehement racism that was part of her movement. I found the moments where they had her engaging with her son's closeted but also very obvious queerness to be really puzzling, because she railed against homosexuality throughout her anti-ERA movement. And so for them to sort of, again, displace it in a sort of fictional way, as if this was coming from elsewhere in the movement or other conservatives, was so strange to me. This was part and parcel of her anti-communist and her anti-ERA politics. I also just want to briefly answer, is a woman wielding power by definition feminist? No, the short answer is no. I mean, the feminism is what you do with it, which is to say, depending on which feminism we're talking about, but at the very least, we have to see it as an anti-sexist movement. And Schlafly's use of power was to shore up patriarchy and sexism, and to make it so that women, the path of least resistance for them was to slide into male-dominated relationships. She threw sand in the gears behind her and all around her to make it harder for other women. So if wielding power is feminism, then there's a lot of people who I think would be surprised to find themselves with that label.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with Gill's points. I also think that where I had this moment of like, really? where we're in the early 70s and she walks in to a congressional office and they ask her to take notes. And it was a little like, by the early 70s, Phil Crane's office would never have asked Phyllis Schlafly to be their secretary for a meeting. By that point, she'd already done various testimonies to defense committees and that kind of thing. And so she already had a reputation. I mean, Fred Schlafly, her husband, was a very high profile lawyer for various conservative entities, right? And so there was already a kind of clout that she had that most people aren't going to recognize, right? Because they don't think of the conservative movement in that way at that point. But for people on the inside, right, they already knew who she was. And certainly, I don't believe that even in the early 70s that someone like Phil Crane is going to be like, oh, by the way, you can note take this, right? So I just feel like in some ways, Schlafly's power dynamic is misunderstood. And the other aspect is in terms of her relationship to her son, John. It is really interesting because it's kind of like the thing that they, as far as I can tell, never talked about it, right? It was a very much don't ask, don't tell kind of household. And that part of the portrayal really felt bizarre to me as well, Gill.
Mm-hmm. And Kacey, if I could ask you to talk a little bit about, is Phyllis Schlafly, should we understand her as a feminist? Is it feminist to wield power?
Oh, I don't think we need to understand Phyllis Schlafly as a feminist. I think the interesting thing is that her death provoked this conversation, right, that Phyllis Schlafly was conservative feminism, right? So you have people like Tomi Lahren and all sorts of popular conservative female figureheads talking in the immediate wake after her death about how there was such a thing as a conservative feminism, right, going into 2016. And so I kind of wonder to the extent to which these current conversations that conservative women are having in remembrance of Schlafly really shaped her portrayal within the series itself, right? That the series is a product of where we're at on the eve of a new election, sans Schlafly, but still kind of living out the vision of America that she had.
And I wonder, we're having a really important conversation right now in this country about who we memorialize and how we memorialize them. And I think it was Gloria Steinem in her comments about Mrs. America. She was very dismissive of the series as people who are contemporaneously portrayed in film sometimes can be, who don't participate in the project. But she was also just like I think that she was frustrated by the decision to pick out these handful of women and to understand the movement through their eyes. And I don't, and so please, the two of you can jump in here and correct me. I don't study 20th century political movements, but I think there was a very deliberate choice on the part of Steinem and others to not, or to try and do away with that kind of a movement that designated leaders and spokespeople, and to rather focus on a more collective approach and conversation. And so, I was thinking about Kacey's comment that we're replicating something in the way that Hulu chose to single out 4 or 5 people and see a really complex, multifaceted movement through their eyes and through solely the issues around the ERA. And so what did you think about the format? What do you think about the ways that we are choosing to remember or memorialize women's liberation?
It's such a hard question about how to tell a story about a movement, and how can you do it in a way that's coherent if you don't organize it around characters. I don't have a good answer for storytelling. I mean, I'm guilty of that myself in my own podcast, where we will hone in on a single person in order to make them stand in for larger social currents. I think the series itself did a decent job of showing a lot of moving parts and a lot of different people to show the movements as complex. But I think it also spoke to the ways in which people like Friedan and Steinem themselves wrestled with their own visibility. I mean, Brown Miller too, who we did a portrait of in our podcast recently, came up against these tensions of what did it mean to achieve celebrity status and recognition within a broader social movement. And there was certainly a lot within second wave feminism of resentment of people who got media attention. But this was sort of played into a broader, I think, conflict that both conservative movements and feminist movements ran up against, which is a lot of their medium to get their message across was pop culture, was the media. They needed to have figureheads, they needed to have talking points, and they needed to have someone appealing to deliver them. This is part why Schlafly was so successful. She looked genial, she was attractive, she was intelligent, and she was incredibly media savvy. So too was Friedan and Steinem. I mean, Friedan far less disciplined in many ways, but still very able to do it. And so in many ways, we're stuck with the ways in which we use the media and the media uses movements to tell each other's stories. And so we're going to have certain figureheads who are, time and again, the spokespeople for it. Now, can we gesture intelligently to show that social movements are complex, internally diverse, moving, social relations that are often exhausting and exhausted and also incredibly contradictory? It's really hard to tell that as a story, right? So, and it's hard for us to narrate that to our students. I think sociologists do a very good job of sort of saying, okay, we're going to begin by defining a social movement as this, but we're also going to gravitate towards a series of conversations and figures. And so I don't fault the Hulu series for gravitating towards figures. I think they're replaying much of how people at this time understood it as sort of banner moments, banner figures, and big debates. And they often showcase these debates that feminists and anti-feminists had, because that was part of the media culture at the time, where they'd have, we're going to have this person to represent the movement, and that person would indeed both, represent and represent the movement at that time. I'm going on and on though.
For me, what was interesting is who they decided to highlight. And again, I think Gill has a point that maybe part of this decision was, kind of the way in which we remember it without necessarily honing in on some of the really influential people, right? Like Patsy Mink, again, is somebody who was very responsible for getting that funding through for things like the IWY, right? She was very, very hands-on congressionally with the movement in the 70s especially. And so, and someone like Patsy Mink coming from Hawaii, right, adds this whole other layer of feminist politics based in empire, as Judy Wu's work talks a lot about. And so I think that in one way we see a really complex, kind of messy feminist movement, right? With like a lot of different directions. And in some ways it still feels like the series replicated sort of a black-white politics. And I think that there was certainly room to incorporate some other kinds of feminist organizing in that. It would have been great to have, I think, more specific inclusion of groups like the Radical Lesbians or like the Combahee River Collective, right, as these major women's groups in the 70s that really kind of were asking for feminist change different from the ways that some other groups were thinking about it.
Well, that is a perfect send up. Thank you, Kacey, for my next question, because I was going to say that we talked about the sort of coalitions and the ways that there was a crystallization of issues for conservatives, right, for Phyllis Schlafly and others. But we haven't yet really talked about the coalitions operating for the second wave feminism, including ERA, but beyond the ERA. And so, of course, Hulu singles out Shirley Chisholm to talk about the connections between the Black freedom movement and the women's liberation movement. I think that, well, I wonder if you could talk, both of you, a little bit about the coalitions between working class women, between sort of, you know, women organizing against colonialism from the global South, Black women, lesbian women, that existed. And then also, if I can sneak in a second question here, failed opportunities for coalition building, right? That either by focusing solely on the ERA or by missing these opportunities to build coalitions, how do we think about the white identity politics in second wave feminism? Should I put one of you on the spot? Okay, thank you, Gill.
I'm happy to. I know I've been answering first, so I was trying to patiently wait, but I'll take it. So I think one of the things I want to do is just reframe a little bit. It's not a dodge, but a way of thinking about what's happening contemporaneous to the ERA, which is, you know, the series Mrs. America ends with the Houston rally, right, in '77, and the counter rally for the conservatives. And I think that it sort of gestures to, but doesn't really get at what were some of the things on the various planks. And this was an incredibly ambitious feminist agenda. So they had things, of course, ERA was the centerpiece. And we should see this as a tool that would allow various feminist movements, pro-women movements, to enact a series of legislative challenges and goals to do the various works of equalities that were on the table. And so this was meant to be basically a constitutional tool with wide-ranging effects. But also at Houston, there were planks about domestic violence, sexual violence, reproductive freedom, gay rights, childcare, something called the Displaced Homemakers Bill. And so there was all sorts of issues. And also at Houston, as we saw in the series, through, I think, a conservative woman's, I'm not sure if it was an acid trip or very drunken binge, I wasn't quite sure. I might have fallen asleep for a few moments, but you see her moving through the currents of cultural feminism and radical feminism and liberal feminism. This is coinciding with ideas about women's spirituality and women's culture and women's identity. So I think that what we see in this particular series, but also how we should understand feminism at this particular moment at the ERA, is a wide-ranging conversation among different interest groups that is incredibly intersectional. Now, is the movement divided along class and racial lines? Absolutely. And folks like Winnie Brynis and Meredith Tax and others have spotlighted this. But I think that to see the ERA as simply a single issue rather than as a intersection or a constellation, drawing in multiple stakeholders to use this as a legislative tool to enact various agendas, I think reduces the complexity of what the ERA does. And so when critics like Schlafly sort of mark all the ways that the ERA, in her words, can cause mischief, she's recognizing the purpose of it, which is to give a multi-tool to various women's movements. So I want to start us off there to say that second wave feminism was white dominated in many ways. But as Brynis and others pointed out, the work of outreach was ongoing and also ever incomplete and failing. And this had to do with mutual enmity and distrust, but also the ways in which white privilege sort of was shot through both radical feminism and liberal feminism. But I don't want to erase the many, many women, including contemporaneous to the ERA, an African-American new president of now. And so we need to sort of, I mean, Eileen Hernandez is there at the forefront. So I think it would do us, I think we need to both address the ways in which whiteness operated, but also, and I'm speaking in broad strokes for the purpose of this, the very interracial and multi-class conversation magnetizing around the ERA, and you can see it at Houston.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that is so kind of exciting and messy and complicated about second wave feminism is that, you know, you have this emphasis on consciousness raising groups, right? And that applies to women from all different kinds of backgrounds, right? And so issues that might affect, you know, for example, Mexican-American women are going to be a whole set of different issues than what other maybe more mainstream white middle class women think of as their brand of feminism, right? So for example, in the 70s, you know, disabled women were really active in things like, how do we get curb cuts? How do we have access to buildings? Can we get any sort of disability civil rights? You know, it would be great in terms of moving toward equality if disabled people can access a bus in the first place, right? And so that is to say, those are feminist politics, right? But that's not the same kind of feminist platform that maybe other groups of women are thinking about, right? In terms of what do they need in terms of making their life quality more empowering, right? Like things like Black women are working on various forms of, you know, prison abolition and things like that, which is not on the radar for other groups, right? And so there is a plethora of ways in which different communities could come to feminism. And it's kind of one of the things that's really quite exciting about the Houston gathering, right? Is that you have really diverse groups of women thinking about the planks that need to go into the spirit of Houston in order to improve the quality of the lives of diverse women across America.
I wonder, for a last question, I was thinking that I think it's Rebecca Traister, who was one of the final people to interview Phyllis Schlafly before she dies. And at the 2016 convention, she says, wouldn't it be funny if the ERA passed, right? I mean, and Phyllis Schlafly, I forget the exact exchange, but she, you know. And of course, now the ERA is once again sort of in the news and gaining steam, and several states have ratified the ERA. Now several states that had passed the ERA want to rescind their ratification of the ERA. So do you have any thoughts about the ERA now, where it goes in the future? Is it a useful goal around which people can and should organize moving forward into the 2020 election and beyond?
The many dangers Schlafly has warned about have all come to pass. Women in the military, gay marriage, gender neutral bathrooms. I mean, we're living in the present, and I mean, the world's not ending because of those things, certainly other things. But so the catastrophe that she warned about, it's all here and was done without the ERA. And so I'm sure there will be all sorts of other specters that will haunt us from conservatives as they sort of warn against its dangers. I'm not a great political strategist, but I will say this. If the ERA can mobilize a progressive coalition to enact a progressive and intersectional agenda that empowers women and is anti-sexist, which are sort of, and I'm going to use women in the most capacious term imaginable here, and is also anti-sexist, I mean, great. That would be fantastic. If it allows for all of the things that were dreamed of at Houston, childcare, let's just say childcare, healthcare, abortion rights, gay rights, all of these things that have been ongoing struggles. I mean, the dreams of Houston have still not been realized. And so I think we're very much still stuck in the 70s in so many ways. And still fighting these same battles. If the ERA becomes a tool to enact these, I think that it will be a battle well worth fighting.
It's really interesting. I was actually in the process of writing to Schlafly the day that she died. And all of a sudden I'm sitting there drafting a message to her and my phone was blowing up. And it was like I knew what had happened before I even looked at my phone. So I think in a lot of ways, one of the funny aspects about the 70s was that, you know, feminist organizers were really saying, wait, there is no precedent for rescinding your yes vote on the ERA. Like that can't be something that could be done, right? And so that was one of the tactics that was tried in order to prevent these various states from backing out of the ERA in the first place. I kind of expect to see conservatives try to say, oh, no, they can't re-up their vote now because, you know, 1983, it's been expired, no way, you know. And I do see that in some of the circulations that I continue to look at as I write, that is already one of the things that's coming back around to kind of haunt, right? That, oh, the feminist activists used that argument in the 70s, so it's as good enough an argument for us now. So it's this interesting way that at least I see things kind of repeating to a different kind of tune.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so many of the issues from the 60s and 70s are back on our radar. And I think as we look forward towards the 2020 election, it is possible. Well, I guess Joe Biden has said that he'll have a woman be his vice president, his running mate. I think about right now the voter disenfranchisement that people are concerned about and the need to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act that has stalled in the Senate. And so, I mean, like Gill, I think, how can we have a coalition of, you know, the coalition that that people tried in the 60s of seeing all of these issues as speaking to one another and being part of a larger whole. And that kind of energy, whether it's talking about the prison industrial complex and Black Lives Matter and voter disenfranchisement, but also the attack on abortion rights and reproductive choice, access to birth control, amidst the COVID, which I sort of chuckled because I'm sure Phyllis Schlafly would say that was feminists' fault somehow. But the pandemic has illustrated the problem of access to childcare and dual income homes, and that the labor of the pandemic for elder care and childcare has fallen disproportionately on the shoulders of women and set back the careers of people that feminists had fought so hard to launch in the 60s and 70s. So it just does really feel like, I don't know whether it's 2 steps forward and 2 steps back, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, 2 steps back and 1 step forward. I'm not sure, but it's in the air, right? All of these conversations that we've been having for 40, 50 years seem to be back on the docket in 2020 in really interesting and important ways. And in ways that suggest sort of fresh air to be breathed into a movement and new ways to be thinking about these issues that have been around for a long time. Not really a question there. More of a summation. Go ahead, Kacey.
I was just going to say, I think one of the important things in terms of coalition moving forward is paying as much attention to the courts as conservatives have paid. Schlafly, even before the ERA in the late 60s, she really cared about judges and nominations for the courts and realized that that was a really important mechanism to control institutional power. And I think that that is one thing that progressive coalitions could be much more attentive to moving forward, to try to finally realize a lot of these issues that have been left unfinished since the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your time with us and also your expertise with us. And we look forward to a revitalized movement in which both of you will have much to say and an important part to play. And we thank you for your contributions today. So the unfinished work of suffrage, 2020. may this be the year that we finish it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Gill.